Good evening. Good evening. I am Julie Davis, President of City Club, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program. Before we get started, I want to remind most of us in North America that we live on stolen land. Here in the Portland region, this is the territory of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, and Clackamas, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Molalla, the Wasco, Cowlitz, and many other indigenous people who have known the Columbia and Willamette rivers as their homes for thousands of years. Together, we recognize their unbreakable connection to this land, and we honor the resilience of their ancestors and the hopes of future generations. Tonight, City Club is hosting a debate between two candidates running to become Oregon's next Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan and Kim Thatcher. Before we get started, I want to recognize and thank the producer of tonight's debate, Samantha Ritterbush, and I want to say thank you to the entire program committee for working so hard to make tonight's event possible. More than 100 years ago, City Club hosted its first debate. While much has changed since then, City Club continues to be an independent, nonpartisan organization committed to providing a space for people to gather and participate in lively conversations about the critical issues confronting our communities. Even today, as COVID-19 challenges our social norms, City Club continues to work towards more open and inclusive public squares. City Club has been sustained all these years through the generous support of our members, individual donors, foundations, nonprofits, and businesses, small and large. Tonight, we are grateful for this collective support from all of our members and donors. You make it possible for us to host our fall season of forums and debates. I want to take a moment to recognize our season sponsors, Chevron and Northwest Natural, and acknowledge our partners, Morel Inc., Merge Design, Pamplin Media, and X-Ray FM. We appreciate your shared commitment to helping Oregon voters get informed. If City Club's work aligns with your values, I hope you'll support us as we continue to produce forums and debates, lead public policy research, and advocate for positive change. Here are two ways you can support our work. You can start by becoming a City Club member. For more than 100 years, our members and supporters have helped City Club hold Oregon leaders accountable. You can learn more about membership online at pdx.cityclub.org/community/membership. You can also support our work by making a donation tonight. Our events, which are free to all, are made possible by individuals just like you. Please consider making a gift of $50, $25, or $10 to help us continue to provide thought-provoking debates and conversation. You can donate now by texting Support City Club to 44321. That is Support City Club, all one word, to 44321. Or you can give via our website, pdxcityclub.org/donate. Whether you become a member, make a gift, share the link with a friend, or just watch tonight's debate. All of us at City Club want to thank you for participating and helping bring the public square live to your homes. It is now my pleasure to welcome John Schrog, Executive Director at the Pamplin Media Group, which includes the Portland Tribune. John will be our moderator for tonight's debate.
Great, thank you so much, and welcome to City Club's Secretary of State debate with State Senator Shemia Fagan and State Senator Kim Thatcher. We have only about an hour for this debate, and we're running a little bit late, so I am going to get right to the rules so you know how we're going to begin. To get started, each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. Once the statements have concluded, we'll move on to my questions for the candidates, which includes a lightning round. Once my questions have concluded, the candidates each can ask one prepared question to their opponent, and from there, we'll move on to what everyone's waiting for, the audience questions. If you have a question for the candidates, you can still post them on Twitter or Facebook using the hashtag VoteOR2020. Again, that's hashtag VoteOR2020. One interesting wrinkle that City Club has thrown into this debate is called the free speech pass. If a candidate would like to rebut a point made by their opponent or extend their own answer time or clarify a response, the candidate simply raises a free speech pass. Each candidate has 2 of those passes, each of which are worth 30 seconds. Finally, we'll close the debate with a 2-minute statement from each candidate. The intention tonight is to distribute questions and time allotted fairly equally. However, as moderator, I reserve the right to ask for clarification should it be appropriate and helpful to the discussion. And I think I promise I won't go Chris Wallace on you all if both of you don't go Joe Biden and Donald Trump on each other. Okay, so let's agree to that. All right, we flipped a coin to determine who would give their opening remarks first. Senator Thatcher, congratulations, you won the coin toss, so you can begin with your opening statement.
Okay, well, thank you, City Club of Portland. It's a pleasure. I would just say Oregon is at a crossroads, and our next Secretary of State needs to be a strong, steady leader committed to getting Oregon back on track. Oregon's response to COVID, civil unrest, the wildfires, and whatever else might be coming at us next will be my top priorities. Since I was elected to the Oregon House in 2004 and cleared to my service in the Senate today, my focus has been on many of the issues that deal directly with the Secretary of State's office, especially being the longest serving member of the Legislative Audits Committee. The Audits Division is where hard questions can find answers, such as how come thousands of unemployed Oregonians have yet to receive their benefits? How do we know billions of dollars in education funding is actually helping students succeed? How can we better manage Oregon's forest and wildfire response? And with ballots going out soon and thousands of mailboxes having been burned down, I've advocated for these displaced voters, and I think our state should be doing more to help them. Oregon's vote by mail has a lot of safeguards in place, but as this disaster shows, there's always room for improvement. Over the years, I've worked on many election integrity issues, and along with my 16 years in the public sector, I've owned a small business for 28 years. My companies deal with road construction, with lots of moving parts and people. This management experience helps run the Secretary of State's office. But more importantly, my business experience also led me to pass a bill in 2011, which eventually created the Small Business Advocates located in the Secretary of State's office. And I think it's clear that we really need this advocate now to help Oregon small businesses get back on their feet. We need a strong, steady leader, experienced and work to get Oregon back on track, and who sees this as a nonpartisan position. I'm Kim Thatcher and hope to earn your vote in November.
Great, thank you, Senator Thatcher. Senator Fagan?
Well, good evening. My name is Shamia Fagan, and I am running to be your Secretary of State. I first became aware of politics and democracy growing up in rural Oregon towns in Wasco County. My dad was a staunch Republican and a single parent raising 3 kids in the Dalles and Dufur. My mom was in and out of our lives because she battled addiction for most of my life. And our dad struggled to make ends meet. The summer before I started second grade, my dad took us on a 2-week camping trip. I remember catching crawdads in 8 Mile Creek and sleeping in a big family tent. Years later, my brother told me what really happened. We had been evicted from our home in the Dalles, and we were homeless. That's why I've spent my career as an Oregon lawmaker and a civil rights attorney fighting for other Oregon families who were hanging on by a thread, passing legislation like paid sick leave and helping create the Office of Small Business Assistance in the Secretary of State's office. And I've knocked down barriers to participation in our democracy, from automatic voter registration to expanding vote by mail with prepaid postage. But when I first announced my campaign for Secretary of State, I quickly learned that most people have no idea what this job is. One of my older brothers asked me, "So you'll get other people's coffee?" So I'll tell you, this job for me is about making sure that government works for everybody, from running elections that are fair and secure, auditing state revenues and programs to make sure they make a real difference in the lives of people who need them the most, running our public records to make sure that government is open and transparent, and this year conducting legislative redistricting using a People's Commission to ensure that we address systemic inequities and that Oregon embraces the sacred democratic value of equal representation for all.
Great. Thank both of you for those opening statements. You know, you both mentioned campaigns and elections, and oversight of campaigns and elections is probably the most high-profile responsibility of the office that you're seeking. So let's start there. As of this morning, your combined reported campaign contributions this year total $1,841,269.26. So you're on pace together to raise and spend $2 million for this office. Senator Thatcher, your contributions include multiple five-figure donations from timber companies who have a keen interest on what the Secretary of State does on the Oregon State Lands Board. And Senator Fagan, you've received nearly $700,000, roughly half your donations, from public employees unions whose members are subject to audits conducted by the Secretary of State's office. I guess the first question of the evening is, are limits on campaign contributions or expenditures needed in Oregon? And if so, what would you do to support them? And if not, how do you defend this infusion of special interest money into this office and the campaign? Senator Fagan, let's start with you.
Well, I'm proud to have a broad coalition of Oregonians supporting me from all across the state. And I've been proud to support and work with both parties to help pass campaign finance reform. Measure 107 that Oregonians are going to see on their ballot this fall. Please vote yes to amend the Oregon Constitution to allow us to allow the legislature, and I will do that leadership as the Secretary of State, to pass campaign contribution limits in Oregon. I think it's important that we follow some basic principles, which is that we shouldn't allow any single person or single entity to essentially drown out the voices of all other Oregonians. We need to have individual contribution limits to make sure that folks have to go seek broad support when they run for office. We also need to follow principles that recognize that $1 million from one person is not the same as $1 million from, $1 million from one person is not the same as $1 from a million people. That we want to encourage grassroots fundraising for people to come together and organize around principles and values that they have. And this is something that I have worked very hard on in the legislature, and I will be proud to help lead this effort as Oregon's next Secretary of State.
Great. Thank you so much. Senator Thatcher?
Well, thank you. Yes, I do support the transparency that is called for in Measure 107. And I don't like having unaccountable groups getting together and creating fake websites and then pretending they're for, some sort of neutral third party evaluating candidates when really they're in the tank for one candidate. Most of my fundraising has been from grassroots, where they're actually purposely giving to my campaign and not just given into a pool where some manager gets to figure out who gets to send the money where. And definitely we need that transparency. I don't know what the number should be for limits. I know that this is something that Oregonians want. They have an appetite for putting limits on campaign funding in contributions, but I don't know what that limit might be. And as Secretary of State, I think it would be important to put a multi-partisan group of people together so that we have the ability to come up with good figures, so we're not disadvantaging or advantaging one group or another. So having said that, yes, I do support the Measure 107.
Great. Sticking on the topic of campaigns and elections, I'm going to ask you each a question. It's slightly different. Senator Thatcher, I'll start with you. President Trump, a fellow Republican, regularly attacks vote by mail and suggests that systems like Oregon's are rife with fraud. First, do you agree with him? And second, you voted against both Motor Voter, which automatically registers people to vote when they get their driver's license, as well as the legislation to pay for postage on mail-in ballots. So again, do you agree with the claims that vote by mail is fraudulent? And as Secretary of State, would you support the laws you voted against, or would you work to change them or any other aspects of vote by mail?
I'll see if I can hit all those things. So as far as the Oregon's vote by mail, I believe we do have a lot of safeguards in place that you don't necessarily see in other states. That may be what people are referring to when they're saying that a system is rife with fraud. I don't think that Oregon's system is rife with fraud. So you were talking about motor voter. I did not support motor voter. I was dealing with a lot of constituents who were concerned about the opt-out, and they wanted it to be something they could decide at the counter at the DMV and not have to wait for an obscure postcard to arrive in the mail where they could choose to opt out or whatever. There are some people that also had some privacy concerns. Now, I'm hoping those don't end up being problems. I have not heard that to be the case, but thankfully, but I had constituents that were concerned about privacy. And then on the postage, I was concerned about funding. There have been many times where we've funded things such as Oregon Promise, and then we break our promise later, and then we're not able to keep up with it. And so I just didn't want to set a precedent where that was the case. Also, I want to make sure that we are consistent. It gave people a confusing message that maybe they could drop their ballot off any time and yet have it count. And that's not the case. It needs to be in the office on time.
Senator Fagan, you've been a big supporter of vote by mail and some of the efforts to make it easier to vote. What do you make of the concerns addressed by your opponent, and what changes are needed, if any, to Oregon's vote by mail system?
Right. Well, let me first be the only one to state unequivocally that widespread claims of voter fraud in vote by mail, whether in Oregon or in any other state, those are a myth. And they're a myth perpetrated by people who want to make it harder for certain people to vote. So let's be clear on that. Not just in Oregon, but all across the country, those claims are a myth. My opponent in 2016 said that Oregon's vote by mail system was plagued, and I just couldn't disagree more. Here in Oregon, we have forensic signature verification. We have a paper trail for all of our ballots. Everybody who is an eligible and registered active voter receives a ballot safely and can turn that in safely. We have ballot drop boxes. We also make sure that there's a unique barcode tracking on our ballots to make sure that people only turn in one ballot. So Oregon has incredible safeguards, but we can always do better. Something that I think that we should introduce in all 36 counties, not just in the 3 counties that have it, is ballot tracking. Multnomah and Marion and Yamhill County actually allow voters to sign up to receive a text message once their ballot has been received and once their ballot has been counted. And particularly during this election, when we have the President of the United States out there making wild and claims about the fraud and vote by mail, which are simply false, I think it would give Oregonians a lot of comfort to be able to have that verification when their ballot has been received and when it's been counted.
Great. As I mentioned, I think most people are aware that the Secretary of State has something to do with elections, and perhaps even bringing other people coffee. But one thing that most people don't know is that the Secretary of State has a whole team of auditors, and it's a function largely unrecognized. In the past, legislators have sought some of the authority over the list of performance audits that the Secretary of State conducts. That's a step that could subject the independent audits to partisan influence. So how would you, as Secretary of State, ensure that your office's audits are truly free of politics and offer honest appraisals regardless of who is found at fault or worthy of praise? Senator Fagan, let's start with you.
Well, in a time of a pandemic, a recession, wildfire recovery, and declining revenues, it's more important than ever that we make sure that the programs that are out there intended to serve Oregonians are making a real difference in the lives of people who need that the most. And I would work very closely with the audits director to identify the biggest risks facing Oregonians, and then obviously let those independent professional auditors who follow national auditing standards do their work and come up with those recommendations and that information so the legislature or the executive branch or the Secretary of State can act on that independent, non-biased information. But I'm glad that you brought up folks wanting to, get involved in the audits. In fact, in my opponent, Senator Thatcher, back in 2005, when the Republicans were in charge of the legislature, actually sought to strip the audits function from the Secretary of State when the Secretary of State was a Democrat. Of course, did not seek to strip that same function once the Secretary of State was a Republican. So I agree that it's important that the Secretary of State and that Audits Division is independent and nonpartisan. And the biggest key and the biggest thing that Oregonians can understand is that those professional auditors who work through Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State, they follow those national auditing standards.
Great. Senator Thatcher, how will you make sure that the Audits Division remains independent and free from partisan influence?
I hope that I know that the auditors that are there now are free of this outside influence. And I think it is very important to point out that Oregon is one of the few states that does not have a legislative audits ability. And so that has been a little bit of a frustration for me. And I even suggested that to Secretary of State Dennis Richardson when he was there, that perhaps the legislature should take on the performance audits. Now, something has happened since that time, and it's a good thing. And what it is that the Legislative Audits Committee that I've been serving on for a long time is finally bridging that gap between what the legislature needs to inform its policy and revenue decisions and budget decisions. And there's this, we're bridging the gap and cooperating more on what audits need to be made. The chairs, or actually the whole committee, will make recommendations as to what they would like to see audited. And because that's very important to have that cooperation. And I still think that's important to have that cooperation. There's also the tip line, the hotline. It's often, very often, employees that are calling in and talking about an agency. I think those need to be investigated, and they are looked at. And I think just continuing in that vein is very important. And I support cooperation.
Great. Historically, the Secretary of State's office, which houses the Archives Division, has taken a strong interest in government transparency. A year ago, Governor Kate Brown came out in favor of ensuring the credibility of Oregon's public records advocate by making that relatively new office independent from any elected official. A bill from the Public Records Advisory Council to do just this was approved by 2 committee votes early in this year's legislative session, but did not make it through both chambers before the session was shut down. So I guess I'm going to start with you, Senator Thatcher. What do you think the autonomy of the public records advocate should be? And specifically, would you work to find a dedicated funding source for the Public Records Advocate Office, similar to that enjoyed by the Government Ethics Office, to help give it a little bit more independence?
Well, definitely. I'm on the Public Records Advisory Council, and we have definitely been talking about that pretty much every meeting we've had about the bill that we want to have introduced. And I carried that bill on the floor to bring that independence, and then it just didn't quite make it through the vote on the House side. However, it will be reintroduced again in the 2021 session. We are wanting, as a council, to find an advocate who is answerable to the council. It's a broad range of people who are involved with public records and have an interest, whether they're in the public sector, the private sector, the media, or what have you. And making sure that we have that independence and that there's not influence from the legislature or a particular branch of government. We need to make sure that that office and that advisory council are, their own entity and not answerable to a political entity. So as a member of this group, I am a non-voting member, and I get to serve and advise, but I don't get to vote on the different things that are put before the committee. But it's very important that be put in place, and we help with the funding, and maybe we'll figure out some way of getting that funding figured out. We're working on it.
Great. So Senator Fagan, again, what do you think about the autonomy of the public records advocate position, and should there be a separate funding source to keep that office independent from any of the elected officials or legislature?
Yes and yes. I supported the vote that would have made the public record, that would have taken the Record Advisory Committee's recommendations and to make that an independent position. Unfortunately, even though that passed unanimously in the Senate, it didn't pass in the House because that's when the House and Senate Republicans walked out and shut down the government. And then the legislature couldn't pass any bills. And I think it's a good example of how a lot of really good bills that had really broad support that were good for transparency and openness for Oregonian simply couldn't get through the process because Oregonians were denied a functioning legislature. But I think it's very important that that position is independent. Oregonians need to trust that when they request public records or when the newspapers and the media request public records, that there's actually an advocate in the office fighting for them, who's actually advocating for them. And that is what the Public Records Advisory Committee has proposed for that public records position.
Great. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. I'm going to ask each of you a question on a related topic. I'm going to start with you, Senator Fagan. Our state public employees unions have been pretty upfront about wanting to send a message to one of your primary opponents, Senator Mark Hass, because he supported some reforms to the public employees pension system. They backed an alternative Democratic candidate, as you know, and when she dropped out and you entered the race late, as we've seen, they put a lot of money behind you. As you said, you're proud of all that support, but can you give us an example or two of where you voted in ways that the public employees unions were at odds with you, and explain how you prepare to show your independence from a group that has been so supportive?
Well, first off, I'm proud to have the support of Senator Mark Hass for Secretary of State. He's endorsed me, and you'll see that endorsement in my voters pamphlet. You know, when you ask me, why do public employee unions support me? It is not because somebody else voted a certain way. It's because throughout my entire political service, I have stood by certain principles. I believe people should be paid a living wage for the work they do. I believe they should have health insurance. I believe they should have retirement security. I believe they should have paid sick leave and paid time off to take care of family members or welcome a new child into their home. And I believe that they should have a say in the safety and functionality of their workplace. So if you're going to ask me for a time when I stood against my own principles, you won't find one, because those are my principles and I'm not interested in standing against my own principles. But I am very proud to have their support. And one organization, the police unions, for example, I have committed as Secretary of State in transparency with public records. Right now, if our police are actually convicted of wrongdoing, that is still not a public record. They are shielded from that. And we see that at times when there is violence by police officers, that folks don't realize that they were somebody that already had wrongdoing because those are shielded from public records. And I have committed to actually move that forward and advocate for that as Secretary of State.
Very helpful. Senator Thatcher, your career in the legislature has been marked by your vocal dislike of the legislature and the process. In fact, as we've noted, you've twice joined Republican colleagues in walking off the job in protest of the way that the Democratic majority was handling legislation that your party opposed. For someone so disillusioned by one branch of government and the party in power, how can you assure voters that you're going to not become equally disillusioned with this office? And more important, how can you work with these Democrats who you've really clashed with?
Well, first of all, I don't accept the premise that I dislike the legislative process. The legislative process is very important, and that would include the process that people take part in and where they can hold their legislature accountable. And they do that through the longstanding initiative and referendum process. And sometimes there are issues that come before the legislature that are just bigger than the legislature, and people need to be able to be given the chance to weigh in. And had they been given that chance to weigh in on this large, bigger than the legislature bill, then you would not have seen a quorum denial. And there is a process, and that's part of the process, is quorum denial. In fact, when the Democrats had walked out over redistricting a few years before that, it is just clearly part of the process. And when there is, when I'm working with Democrats, one of the things I'm proud of is the transparency website. I worked with Democrats in 2011, I believe it was, when we were split in the House, 30 members Democrat and 30 members Republican. And we got together and we wanted to show the people of Oregon, you know, if any Republican has to pass anything, they have to work with Democrats. So I'm well practiced in working with Democrats.
All right. Thank you for fielding my very long and sometimes convoluted questions. We're going to make things a little easier now. We're going to shift into what we call the lightning round. So first of all, the first question, these are basically yes or no questions. And I know that candidates do not like these. So I'm gonna make my first question sort of a softball, which is that we have a lot of questions we didn't get to. So if I get your campaigns, the questions that we didn't get to, as well as all these lightning round questions, and give you the opportunity to expand on them, can you get us answers by the end of the week so we can share them with City Club and they can post them on their website? So
Sure.
can I get a yes from both of you? All right,
Yes.
You did great. First lightning round question, you both aced it. All right. Here's one. Back to public records. Public agencies often seek to recover the full cost of getting public records. And this has led to some really exorbitant fees that are imposed, not just on journalists, but on veterans and other people seeking public records. As Secretary of State, would you be open to pursuing legislation to reduce fees for better access to public records? Yes? No?
Yes.
Yes.
Senator Thatcher? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. We know from history that Secretary of States can play a major role in redistricting every 10 years if the governor and legislature can't reach an agreement. Is that an appropriate role for the office headed by someone from in a partisan race? Do you think the redistricting function is still appropriate for the Secretary of State if it comes to that? Senator Fagan, yes? No?
This time it has to, because it's Oregon, it's constitutional in Oregon, but I will be proposing a People's Commission.
Okay. Senator Thatcher, granted, this time there's not much choice, but looking forward.
Well,
Is that a role
I
that
think
should
the partisan processes, I think the most partisan process is that the legislature draws the lines, and I know that's been in the Constitution for a long time, but yes, the Secretary of State in this case, and I have committed all along in my campaign that I would honor what was in Initiative Petition 57 with the Independent Commission.
Right. Similarly, given the Secretary of State's oversight of audits, elections, and occasionally legislative boundaries, how open, on a scale of 0 to 10, how open are you to the idea of making the Oregon Secretary of State eventually a nonpartisan office? So again, 0 is hell no, 10 is I'm on board. And again, we're not talking about your term, we're talking about at some point. So Senator Thatcher, is that an idea you'd entertain?
10, yes.
Senator Fagan?
I think that it would be if Oregon had a separate lieutenant governor, but it's important because the Secretary of State is also the lieutenant governor. I think that Oregonians have a right to know our values.
All right, good caveat. Secretaries of States, I think the last time I checked, they do about 70 or so audits a year. Can either of you point to an audit that you feel in the past few years that you feel has made a positive difference in state policy? You're nodding, Senator Fagan?
Yes.
So
is this still the lightning round?
It's still the lightning round. Yeah, I'm being inconsistent here. What is it?
Well, I mean,
the
DHS audit from Secretary Richardson, the audit on the prescription drug management program from Secretary Richardson, the audit on public records from Secretary Atkins, the audit on the Oregon Community and Housing Services and affordable housing supply from Secretary Atkins, eligibility for public programs from Secretary of State Brown. There's a lot of good ones.
Okay. Senator Thatcher, she stole a bunch of them. Any particular audits that come to mind?
Thank you. Yes, a lot of those, but also the Portland Public Schools, the racial equity. I thought that was a good one that made it pointed out some things that really need to be changed in our schools. And then there's the foster kids, and then there's the employment department that was been pointed out a couple times that they were gonna be in trouble if we faced a downturn, and they had a surge in claims, and here we are. And I believe that is now underway as far as another audit is concerned about what the heck happened there.
All right, this is the last lightning round question, then we're going to take a break and move to audience questions. So the last lightning round question, and I don't normally like equating politics with sports, but please indulge me. If you could play a professional sport, what would it be? What specific team would you play for? And most important, what would your walk-up music be? Senator Fagan, I'm going to put you on the spot.
WNBA, I would join the Oregon Ducks' Sabrina Ionescu with the New York Liberty, and my walk-up music would be Lizzo, Good as Hell.
All right. Senator Thatcher, the gauntlet has been thrown down.
Well, I always want to be a race car driver. As far as any, walk-up music, Radar Love, I don't know.
All right, that works. All right, with that, we're almost, as I said, we're almost ready to hear questions from our audience. And participants have submitted their questions in advance, and you can still squeeze them in at questions@pdxcityclub.org or post it to Facebook City Club using, again, hashtag #VoteOR2020. But we're going to take a moment now to collect the questions and recognize our sponsors. So somehow that is magically going to happen.
Okay, all done.
There you go, guys.
What if all this waste wasn't waste at all? What if it was renewable energy that could be stored and delivered through existing pipelines, capturing greenhouse gases before they enter our atmosphere? Welcome to What If, and meet the newest renewable natural gas, an energy source that can get us closer to a future of less. Northwest Natural, less we can.
It's only human to pursue the elusive, while also capturing the possibilities, even something like CO2. Over the last decade, Chevron has spent over $1 billion on carbon capture projects and is investing in startup companies working to transform carbon into new forms of energy.
All right, we are going to move into audience questions, and then remind me if I forget. You do get to ask each get to ask the other a question. But first, all right, I think we're going to do that first. So I'm assuming you prepared for this. Senator Thatcher, what is your question for Senator Fagan?
All right, got it right here. Shamia, you served part of a term on the school board, then ran for the Oregon House and served for a couple of terms. Left there, moved, then ran for a Senate seat, which you are now halfway through. And now you're running for Secretary of State. With this pattern, why should voters trust you will serve all 4 years if you're elected Secretary of State and not just run for governor in 2 years?
Well, first, thank you for reminding Oregonians how many different places that I have served and that I have never lost an election. So I have, yes, served Oregonians as a school board member and as a Oregon House member for 2 terms and in the Oregon Senate. And so I am running to be Oregon's Secretary of State. If folks look at my legislative record, they will find that from the very beginning, the very first bill that I ever chief co-sponsored was to create the Office of Small Business Assistance in the Secretary of State's office. The first time I ever walked into the Secretary of State's office was to meet with then Secretary of State Kate Brown, and other voting rights advocates to try and map out a path to automatic voter registration. As you know, I worked with Republicans over the objections of Senate Democratic leadership to enter Oregon into the National Popular Vote Compact, and then most recently worked to add prepaid postage to our ballot. So Oregonians can be very confident that I have been working on issues directly relating to the Secretary of State's office since I first joined the legislature in 2013.
All right, and your question for Senator Thatcher
Yes, thank you.
Oh, hold on. Okay, in a free speech pass, so you'll get an extra 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, my free speech pass is, the question didn't get answered. How can people trust that you're going to serve out your term in the Secretary of State's office and not just run for governor in a couple of years?
I will let you answer that more specific question. Go ahead, and Senator Fagan.
Right. Well, as Oregonians know, Oregon's next Secretary of State is also Oregon's lieutenant governor. And so you can't possibly commit because you may have to be called upon. But I have no intention of running for governor in 2 years or beyond. I'm looking forward to be Oregon's Secretary of State, as my long legislative record on issues directly relating to this office, helping small businesses, and expanding our democracy show.
All right. Now your question for Senator Thatcher.
Thank you. Kim, in previous forums, you have repeatedly refused to say who you're voting for president. But right now, we have a very important election and a president who has repeatedly lied about vote by mail, who won't condemn white supremacists, who has refused to say if he'll agree to a peaceful transfer of power. And in fact, one of the first things that Dennis Richardson had to do as Oregon's Secretary of State was refute Trump's claims of voter fraud in Oregon. Can you really tell Oregonians with a straight face that they don't get to know if you're supporting Trump again?
I think it's important for the Secretary of State not to be weighing in on candidates that don't relate, or ballot measures that don't relate to the Secretary of State's office. Now, I agree with Secretary of State Dennis Richardson. After questioning him and delving into it as much as I could, I believe him when he says there's very little fraud found, and we have a really good system. And as far as condemning white supremacists, I do not believe that racism belongs in Oregon in any form. And peaceful transfer of power, I sure hope that we can continue that tradition as Americans and have that peaceful transfer of power, or hope we don't turn into a banana republic. And I just think it's important to go ahead and be neutral as far as who I'm voting for. It doesn't really matter. It matters who Oregonians are voting for and how their vote will be held sacred.
Okay. We now go to the audience questions, and I'm really glad for this first one because it's a topic we didn't get to at all. So this is for both of you, and we will start with Senator Thatcher. If elected to be Oregon's Secretary of State, and therefore a member of the State Land Board, how would you manage the Elliott State Forest and other lands? What would be your priorities for state lands that contribute to the Common School Fund?
You know, I think it was mentioned during the Democratic primary that that is kind of vague what the land board is supposed to do. And I think it might be worth another look as Secretary of State to maybe put together some stakeholders of, environmentalists and other land users, such as the, recreational users and all that, and refocus on what is it? What are the directives, the proper directives and mandates that we should be looking at as a state? It is a little bit vague right now. So I do think that's important. As far as the Elliott, it was starting to cost the state money. Basically, half the state, or excuse me, half the forest became, having to deal with habitat that just became really expensive to administer. So it has to stay in state hands, and there are some proposals that are out there now that I would be evaluating as Secretary of State and a vote on the land board.
Great. Senator Fagan, a reminder, the question is, in general, your role on the state land boards, and specifically any ideas on how to manage the Elliott State Forest?
Right. Well, I think the State Lands Board is an incredibly important role of the Secretary of State. And just for your listeners, it is the governor and the treasurer and the Secretary of State who sit on the State Land Board. And it's actually a constitutional office or a provision in Oregon. It has been there for a long time. I think it's really important that the next Secretary of State knows and follows Oregon values of conservation. I'm very proud to be endorsed by both the Sierra Club and the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, and to state unequivocally that I would not sell our largest old growth forest to private timber companies for logging. In fact, there's a really exciting proposal from Oregon State University to actually use the Elliott as a state-owned research forest, which would meet a lot of the goals that the conservation-minded State Land Board has had for the Elliott, which includes keeping the forest publicly owned, but decoupling it from the Common School Fund so it doesn't cost the Common School Fund money, compensating the Common School Fund for the Elliott Forest, allowing there to be public use, releasing the forest from its obligation to generate revenue for the Common School Fund, and then, of course, continuing habitat conservation and to protect species in the Elliott.
Great. You're gonna see there is a continued interest in the elections and campaigns. Our second audience question notes that most other mail-in voting states also have in-person polling centers and same-day registration. So I know we've talked a lot about this, but specifically, would you encourage the legislature to add both these measures, which is in-person polling centers and same-day registration as in your office as Secretary of State? Senator Fagan?
Definitely support same-day registration. As someone who grew up in the Dalles during the Rajneeshpuram, which is kind of when we took that away, I ate at Dave's Hometown Pizza in the Dalles, which was one of the places that they poisoned. But yes, I'm very supportive of same-day voter registration. For this listener or this questioner, good news is Oregon does have in-person polling places. Many people don't know this, but it's actually in statute that every county has to have at least one in-person polling spot in the county elections office. And for any county that I believe is over 55,000 people, you have to have one polling booth for every 20,000 people that are in the county. And so the good news is that Oregon already does have in-person polling places, and that's good because some folks certainly use those.
All right. Senator Thatcher, again, in-person polling places and also same-day registration. Your thoughts on those?
You know, I was around when the Rajneeshis were in Antelope, and there have been other times where people have come into some of the rural counties, and they're trying to change the outcome of an election. And so I do prefer that we have, not just same day voting registration. I just don't feel comfortable with that, knowing how that can be manipulated in really small counties with very low population and how people can be brought in just that day. So I'm not for that. But also, it was mentioned, we do have in-person voting at the county clerk's offices, but I really would like to have seen us expand these opportunities and fund having county people man, like what we used to. We were in schools or city halls, different places like that. And I just want to, I wish we could have expanded that for the displaced victims of the wildfires so that they didn't have so far to travel and didn't have to think so hard about voting.
All right, this is going to be the last question before we get to closing statements. So it's got a lot of questions within it from the audience. Campaign finance is an issue in the selection, as we've heard. We've talked a lot about it, and we know voters are very concerned about money in elections. Could each of you share, to the best that you know, roughly how much you've raised since you entered the race, where your largest single donation is from, and how much of your money is from out-of-state sources? So I'll defer to your memory and your honesty on this, though obviously we can go and check it. And if you don't know, just let us know you don't know. Senator Fagan?
Well, I'll do my best. I don't know exactly, but I believe that my largest contribution has been from Emily's List, a pro-choice women's organization. And so I believe they've given me somewhere in the $55,000 range. I'm not the person that does all the campaign cash counting. I kind of do my job every day, prepare for debates and talk to voters and listen to folks. So I believe that is. And what was the other question? Was about out of state?
Yeah, out of state. Do you have any sense as to how much of your money is from out of state? And is that an issue? Maybe that's more important.
I don't have a sense. I don't have a percentage off the top of my head. I think it's important to put together a broad coalition of people. I have donations from, hundreds of thousands of working people across our state, lots of small donations, people giving $50 a month, which I think I'm very proud of. But I'm also proud to be supported by folks that care about things like climate change here in Oregon, and they may give me donations from outside of Oregon for folks that care about that sort of thing.
All right, and Senator Thatcher, again, the specific questions asked were roughly how much you've raised, where your biggest source of your biggest donations from, and how much money is from out-of-state sources, and I would add, is that a concern of money coming from out-of-state sources?
Okay, I'll see if I can hit all those. How much I've raised? $300 plus thousand at this point. I don't know the exact amount. I know some stuff has come in lately. I've been busy. I've been in Southern Oregon and just visiting with folks, and how single largest donations have been in the $10,000 check range. Now, there may have been a couple of $10,000 checks. I don't know. Plus, I have donated some from my business, which is more than that. So that's probably a bigger one. As far as outside the state, if they're just very small individual contributions. Yeah, I think it's important to have as much support from within the state as possible. Having some out of state, I guess, for a state race is one thing. I remember that my opponent received $50,000 from the governor, though, so I guess she forgot about that one.
Okay, that wraps up the questions. We're going to now move to closing statements. And since Senator Thatcher got to go first with opening statements, we're going to reverse that order. Senator Fagan, you can go first with your closing statements.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the City Club and Senator Thatcher for this great discussion. Elections are about choices, and Oregonians have a clear choice between two very different candidates. One candidate who has a voting record expanding voter access, and one who has voted lockstep with her party to restrict it. One candidate who is transparent about who I'm supporting in the election, Joe Biden, and one who will only tell members of her base that information. One candidate who will stand up to lies about Oregon's vote by mail system, and one who stays silent while the president undermines the integrity of our democracy. There's a clear choice, and many of your neighbors have already decided. I'm very proud to be endorsed for Secretary of State by the American Postal Workers Union, the workers who have been delivering our paychecks, our birthday cards, our life-sustaining prescriptions, and our ballots for decades. Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley, two men who Oregonians have been proud to send as Oregon's representatives to the United States Senate. The Oregon League of Conservation Voters, grassroots folks dedicated to preserving our clean air and clean water and addressing the devastating impacts of climate change in our forests. Planned Parenthood PAC, everyday folks who are making sure that our democratic freedoms include reproductive freedoms. And the Oregon State Firefighters Council, the Oregon Education Association, SEIU, the Oregon Nurses Association, and so many other heroes who are on the front lines serving Oregon families today and every day. But I'm not done, not until I can add you to that list. So please learn more or contact me at shamiafororegon.com. I'm Shamia Fagan, and I would be honored to earn your vote this November or this October whenever your family sits down to vote safely by mail here in Oregon.
All right, Senator Thatcher, last word goes to you.
Thank you. So when I announced my run for Secretary of State, the problems facing Oregon at that time pale in comparison to what we're facing now. And it is important we have a leader who's working toward government accountability, transparency, and integrity. I'll work to restore Oregon's people-driven initiative and referenda process. And I will put an independent commission for redistricting in place. Putting people before politicians, something I've committed to do early on in my campaign and not just lately. I'm dedicated to transparency in public records and have created the Oregon Transparency website over a decade ago. And now that you know more about me, let's talk about the choices in November. I have a track record of steady leadership. I've been in my community, Kaiser, for a very long time. I've raised my family there, established 2 long-standing business there. I'm rooted there. I kept serving the public to help my community that I love. And finally, like my friend, the late Dennis Richardson, I don't see this position as being the Republican Secretary of State or the Democrat Secretary of State or the urban or rural, whatever. I look to be Oregon's Secretary of State. I see it as an administrative office with nonpartisan duties. Our campaign won the nomination of the Independent Party of Oregon, and I want all Oregonians to see that I can be a fair and by the book person. I won't be putting my thumb on the scale and applying any of the laws or rules of the state when it comes to the Secretary of State's responsibilities. This is a significant race, and it is about the future of Oregon for the next 10 years. It doesn't matter how you vote, but that you vote. I hope that you see that there are clear choices. And I have a record standing for government accountability, transparency, and integrity. I'm Kim Thatcher, and I hope I can earn your vote.
All right. Well, believe it or not, we ended up ending about on time. A lot of the credit goes to the candidates for keeping their answers short. I really appreciate it. This concludes our candidate debate for Oregon Secretary of State. Thank you, Senators Fagan and Thatcher, for being with us and answering our questions and proving that you can disagree without being disagreeable. These two women have very strong opinions that are at odds with each other, and yet we had a free flow of ideas that was cordial and informative. Thank you both so much for setting the tone. Thank you to City Club for letting me moderate tonight's debate. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope people will tune in and get informed. This is an important race, and this forum certainly provides some ways to decide how to cast your ballot, and that will do it for us. Thank you.